Okay, today I'd like to present a very little bit of the research that I've been working on, examining the discourse surrounding the controversy over a theory that mercury, a known neurotoxin, which was used as a preservative in childhood immunizations, may have caused a peak. This is the controversy. It was alleged to have caused a peak in autism cases in a cohort of American children immunized between 1980 and 2001. So let's start with the definition of autism. So autism is one of the most severe of the autism spectrum disorders, a pervasive developmental disorders characterized by impaired language, nonverbal communication, and social interaction, and repetitive or stereotypically restricted behaviors. Autism, and this is the part, anytime you get into autism etiology, you get a little bit more controversial, but autism, according to this definition, is strongly heritable and epigenetic, and environmental factors are likely to interact with a predisposing genetic background involving multiple gene risks, or multiple risk genes. I like this definition because it actually, to some degree, captures the diversity of published data on autism etiology, but within the published data on autism etiology, there's actually very few people who would actually put all of this together in one definition. So elements of this definition remain contentious because some argue still quite strenuously against any role of environment in the disease's etiology. And then there's another minority who argue that environmental factors may play the key role in the development of autism. Those firmly adhering to an inheritance model of autism tend to also resist any suggestion that there is an autism epidemic. So even that is under dispute. Well, nobody actually argues, though, that the prevalence of autism has risen dramatically. Here's the most recent statistic that I could find from 2007. The findings from this first U.S. multi-site collaborative study to monitor autism spectrum disorders, of which autism is one of the most severe subtypes, prevalence demonstrated consistency across the majority of sites, with statistically significant higher in New Jersey, et cetera, but across all sites, 6.7 per 100,000 children at age 8 years, and these results indicate that ASDs are more common than was believed previously. And so, again, there is still some debate. Yes?
Sorry, is it 100,000?
I'm sorry, I should say 1,000. So that's why these are terrifyingly frightening numbers for anyone working in public health. These are absolutely shocking numbers. But I think that they have created a particular agony for parents dealing with autistic children. Because the parents are trying not only to deal with the treatment options for their child's condition, but trying to sort out what the ultimate root cause was of their condition. At present, there's no recognized cure for autism, and few with a full-blown case of autism along this autism spectrum will be able to function without significant assistance. The current educational and social systems in the United States, and I would argue more broadly in Western countries, are inadequate to assist families dealing with autism. And this places a heavy burden on caregivers. In particular, it places a heavy burden on mothers. So in the past 10 years, as the prevalence of autism, the spectrum disorders has increased, and with that, the prevalence of more serious forms of autism. There have been literally dozens of patient, and might be more accurate to describe them as parent activist groups, that have formed to fill what they see as large gaps in conventional medical research and practice, and are trying to advocate for a significant increase in investment into research, both into the disease etiology, but also into immediate treatments to handle these cases. Now, the groups I'm going to focus on today this is not an exhaustive representation of the autism communities. I'm going to focus on groups today that make three broad claims, and these are very controversial claims. The first claim is that there is a real increase in the incidence of autism. That is still disputed. Some people think that there is really no increase in the actual incidence of autism. This is a case definition issue, or change in case definition. And I'm going to black box that argument for right now. Secondly, they argue that the increase in autism occurred at the same time that there was an expansion of the childhood immunization program in the United States in particular, and the introduction of 3 new thimerosal or mercury-containing vaccines. And just to give you a sense of which vaccines I'm talking about, I don't know, does this have a pointer? Or? Anyway, there are 3 vaccines that are introduced in the childhood schedule between birth and 18 months. And you can see from the mercury, the amount of thimerosal or mercury listed in the very first column, which vaccines actually carry the mercury and when the children are getting this bolus of mercury along this schedule. So you can see that there are 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, they're getting a bolus, as well as if they're receiving an annual influenza immunization, that would be an annual exposure. So that just gives you a sense of the schedule. The third point made by these groups, or the third assertion made by these groups, is that autism is actually, in a subset of cases, is caused by an environmental assault or the exposure to mercury, in particular in the cases that they're arguing about the mercury exposure from routine immunization did contribute to their children's autism. So who are these groups? I'm just going to name some of the most active in this debate. Safe Minds is one of the leading organizations. The group that ACHAMP, which advocates for children's health affected by mercury poisoning. Unlocking Autism, Defeat Autism Now. They're among the most active organizations right now that are active in this particular debate over autism etiology. As well, institutions like the Mind Institute at the University of California at Davies have continued to support a precautionary approach and recommend taking the thimerosal out of the vaccines. Now, it's really important to stop for a moment and to inject some balance into this discourse, because I am really going to focus on the patient activist groups today, but who are putting forward this theory. But I want to let you know that the Mercury-Autism theory has been formally rejected, and statements as recent as last summer have come out from major advisory committees on immunizations in many different countries, including Canada, the United States, and the WHO. And they have published position statements sort of putting a boundary on their perceived risk from thimerosal exposure in vaccines, and that boundary, based on epidemiology, does not really overlap with what the arguments that are being made by these parents necessarily. But I'll qualify that in a minute. The published refutation of this theory, you could say, appears in illustrious journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, Pediatrics, Vaccine, and other leading clinical research journals that you would expect to find this type of research in. However, evidence for an association has been also published in peer-reviewed journals. These associations are not large epidemiological studies, at least not the ones that are perceived as credible. They tend to be basic research on animal models showing a possible theoretical risk of mercury that would be similar to the thimerosal burden, as well as journals that focus on environmental science. You do see more support for at least the hypothesis that it is mercury that is causing some of the syndromes that we're labeling as autism. As well, the journal Medical Hypothesis has published a highly criticized epidemiological study that purports to show a link between mercury and autism. And it's important to note that Medical Hypothesis is a self-stylized, non-peer-reviewed journal that publishes radical medical hypotheses that could not possibly be published in journals like the New England Journal of Medicine. Well, this is from their webpage anyway. They don't say couldn't possibly be published. I interjected that. going through peer review with one of these journals myself, no, I don't think it would be possible. At any rate, right now we have a stalemate. Not necessarily a stalemate in terms of the weight of evidence from a public health perspective, but the epidemiological studies generally lack the power to rule out a very rare adverse event that would affect a genetically susceptible subpopulation. This and a few suggestive environmental studies has kept the door open for anyone to argue that there could be a rare regressive form of autism where thimerosal could theoretically play a contributory role. And I can just imagine what the headline would be from the media right now. U of T public health researcher admits thimerosal could cause autism. Okay, no. So obviously, all those caveats. The debate right now is at a stalemate because of the redefinition of the cases by the parents now qualifying their particular cases of injury as a rare adverse event from these vaccines. And mistrust in these debates is really an understatement to describe the level of vitriol on I would say, it's not quite fair to say on both sides, but there's definitely vitriol on both sides of the debate, although I should say that among public health professionals, there is a little bit more professionalism in the discourse. On the one hand, parent activist groups that I'm focusing on make serious allegations that there's a selectivity in the reading of epidemiological evidence and the way the studies are formulated. There are allegations of outright misconduct, conspiracies, cover-ups, that are made up pretty much against any federal agency that has anything to do with making decisions about routine immunization, approving in new immunizations, or involved in the surveillance of possible adverse events. There's also, ironically, a reactionary counterculture movement comprised of quack watchdogs who make similar allegations against the parent groups and make personal attacks against the parents who are involved in these groups with pretty much a mirroring of the kinds of allegations. Right, self-interest, commercial interests, etc. So one colleague of mine recently, when we were describing and going through some of the primary source materials that I was analyzing, he referred to this volleying of insults back and forth across this debate as a competition between the anti-establishmentarians and the anti-disestablishmentarians. However, the notion of trust in these debates really goes beyond just a challenge of competing authorities, and it's really inextricably linked to ideas about objectivity and how it functions in the production of medical science. So I went back to Lorraine Datson's article for some inspiration on how to actually capture how objectivity is being discussed in these discourses. In her article, Objectivity and Escape from Perspective, she describes how our concept of objectivity betrays signs of a complicated and contingent history, much as the layering of potsherds, marble ruins, and rusted cards in an archaeological ruin. I really like the imagery that she invokes. She describes the topmost layer, or a present-day notion of objectivity, as aperspectival, or aperspectival. I like her imagery better than her rhetoric. A concept of objectivity where knowledge production relies less on the specifics of an individual's makeup and position in the world, or the character or the particular type of creature he or she is. I added the she. The peculiarities of an individual's natural position must be subdued by forgetting oneself in order to attain a true standard in the production of knowledge. However, recurring notions of objectivity in the Mercury-Autism debate not always, but frequently depart from Daston's aperspectival objectivity. Objectivity is described as an emergent property of a more democratic scientific process, where a plurality of viewpoints can intervene in the generation of new hypotheses that will then drive the machinery of modern medical science. This objectivity then hinges on civic participation and engagement in science upstream, and seems to envision participants allowed to formulate and shape research questions, that would be then executed by normal scientists or conventional scientific approaches and methodologies. So this is not like the other anti-vaccination groups that I study. They are not explicitly anti-science. They're not rejecting scientific methods as a way of answering these questions. They're simply asking for the opportunity to ask these questions in the scientific process. And it's the convergence of, they believe, that diverse interests and research that leads to diverse research outputs that will ultimately produce objectivity in science. This process of generating an emergent objectivity allows citizens to compete for resources to explore scientific questions, and it's implied competing with other expert scientific institutions and other interest groups more broadly. And this competition allows them, the way this has functioned in this debate, to hire consultant scientists or to look for authoritative science for hire, to explore the hypotheses that reflect each individual's experiential sense of the disease. The hypotheses generated by these parents in particular center around an idea that there's a subset of cases of autism that's now commonly described in the literature as regressive autism. It's caused by an environmental exposure to some form of toxin, which they suspect mercury is one of the leading toxins. This type of autism is described very distinctly by parents in anecdote after anecdote or testimony after testimony, by a sudden onset after a near normal social interaction. There are appropriate responses and development. Parents argue that an external event is clear in this developmental process. And naturally then, the way they see this as a regressive event, it's natural for them to intuitively look for some sort of external environmental trigger as the underlying root cause of these diseases, or these cases of autism. On the other hand, if you look at what the prevailing theory of autism was at the time, and to some degree still is, it's a very strong sense that autism is a congenital, inheritable disorder whose principal characteristics were already really developed or determined before birth. And this is still, this kind of language still infuses discourse on autism etiology. It's strongly genetic, strongly inheritable. But this description of autism is completely unintuitive to these parents who are describing these regressive cases. In addition, the clinical regression that's noted by patients tended to correlate, not surprisingly, with routine immunization. You can see from the chart that I showed earlier that there are frequent intervening external events, and it's not really surprising that parents may have coincidentally noticed a regression that was simultaneous to the administration of immunization. The immunization had mercury and no neurotoxins, so this is a rational model to explain their child's autism. So the association between a biomedical intervention and the emergence of their child's symptom, so the emergence of a regression in a once normal child, became, in my opinion, a deeply held core belief among these activist groups. And I just want to describe, using their own testimony, just 1 second. Oh, here are just a few, just before I get to the testimony, here are just a few, I was talking about the level of distrust. Here are a few placards held at several rallies between 2005 and 2007, taken from websites of the various activist groups. I won't have time to go into these in great detail, but I'll just read a few. Our babies were well. They had well baby mercury vaccines. Now 1 in 6 kids are neurologically damaged. My siblings were poisoned, and my parents are broke now. Here's just the frontispiece of several of the leading organizations. Here's Safe Minds, and I'll come back to their mission statement at the end of my talk. And here is ACHAMP's Political Action Committee, the front page of their website. And that's the organization that, again, explicitly arguing that mercury poisoning led to their children's autism. But anyway, I want to get to this personal testimony and this kind of testimony is very, very common amongst these alleged cases of regressive autism caused by thimerosal or other forms of environmental mercury. So this is Lynn Redwood, who's the founder and president of Safe Minds. I just showed you their website. She described her own conversion to the theory of Mercury-Autism in a letter describing her son, Will. Shortly after his first birthday, he experienced multiple infections, lost speech, eye contact, developed a very limited diet, and suffered intermittent bouts of diarrhea. He underwent multiple evaluations and was initially diagnosed with a global receptive and expressive speech delay, and later with pervasive developmental disorder, a form of autism. I would have never made a correlation between my son's disabilities and vaccines until July of 1999, when I read that a preservative, thimerosal, utilized in some infant vaccines actually contained 49.6% mercury. So that's in her own words. So thimerosal, this mercury preservative, is 50% ethyl mercury by weight. And since the 1930s, it's been used in non-prescription over-the-counter pharmacologicals, and in particular in multi-dose infant and children's vaccines. Multi-dose vaccines are popular with physicians. They're marginally cheaper as a delivery device in the first world. They're significantly cheaper in the third world, and they're easier to store. But you need the preservative in a multi-dose vial because every time you dip your needle in, there's a theoretical risk of contamination. In 1997, the Food and Drug Modernization Act prompted the FDA to review the use of all mercury in biologics, including vaccines, and the potential exposure to mercury in infants aged 6 months to 2 years was calculated and then compared to a very well publicized at the time Environmental Protection Agency standard, as well as several other standards, which I won't go into, but there is a range. The recommended ranges, I won't go over the recommended ranges, but the bottom line is depending on which agency range you choose, and parents tend to focus on the lowest acceptable standard, which was the EPA standard. For a child of average weight of approximately 5 kilograms, they were receiving up to 125 times the recommended amount of mercury in a single sometimes in a single year, sometimes up to half of that in a single day. So, in July 1999, the Federal Public Health Service and the American Academy of Pediatrics released quite I think a cautionary statement stating their concern that children might be receiving cumulative receiving cumulative mercury exposures through routine vaccination that exceeded federal safety levels for methylmercury. Whether or not this was actually causing any harm was anyone's guess. Dr. Helsley, a well-known vaccine researcher, ironically with close ties to Merck, he argued that all children are not created equally with regard to the risk from exposure to thimerosal. So there were a lot of statements in the public immediately in 1999 when they realized that this was an issue. They gave the impression that that there could be some harm that has been caused by this. Then there were several statements made about, well, this is probably not a problem. This is just going over this. No, really? Okay, so the essentially the statement. There were several statements made in the popular press and released by many of the leading expert bodies and agencies that try to express that there may have been a risk, but also reassure that there was no evidence of harm. And I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip. The CDC did commission a report. The report was performed by an employee, Tom Verstraeten. Verstraeten actually presented an unpublished version of this report to an IOM committee in the summer of 2000, and it is this report that sort of becomes a nexus for the fracturing of trust for many, or at least it spills over the fracturing of distrust in these federal agencies into public discourse and debate. There are allegations that the unpublished report, which was acquired by the Freedom of Information Act, showed statistically significant correlations that were then, when the data was reformulated and finally published almost a year later, those statistically significant associations between the thimerosal and vaccines and a variety of neurological disorders had disappeared. And again, this became a nexus, and this report, I think, still it's seen as a crucible or a critical moment in these debates. And I'll just move on. And when the government was trying to reassure people that the mercury in vaccines was safe, they were also at the same time telling pregnant women not to eat tuna because of the possible extra exposure to mercury. So the Mercury-Autism theorists successfully used a print media campaign to actually undermine or to question the logic of assuring that the vaccines containing mercury were safe and probably didn't cause harm, at the same time warning women not to eat certain foods or to avoid mercury or environmental mercury at all costs. But anyway, I'm just going to skip through to the very end and just summarize what the actual impact of this patient activism is or has been in this arena of vaccine policymaking. Well, the controversy over alleged cover-ups and misconduct tainted expert bodies. The medical profession really had little to offer patients in terms of diagnostics and therapy. And there's some evidence that patients found a conventional approach to autism pessimistic and hostile to the experiences that they were having and the burgeoning expertise of the autism advocacy groups. And this is a similar experience that AIDS activist groups had as well. So many parents really just bypassed the traditional vaccine experts and sought out professionals who were more sympathetic or who offered some kind of therapy to treat their children. And what's interesting about what happens in this debate is that they were able to test their hypotheses by bypassing these specialists and using new available technologies like PubMed databases were newly available. They were able to do intensive research into the disorder. And they also responded to direct marketing from laboratories who started tailoring mercury sensitivity tests and through the Mercury-Autism theorist web pages. Parents could actually take samples from their children and send them off for mercury analysis and then make some kind of judgment of what kind of appropriate therapies. And then that would be tied to private clinics that were offering untested therapies to chelate the mercury out of these children's bodies. Now, well, these democratic incursions into research and into actual therapy by a group of activists committed to an unproven theory might seem like another example of the proliferation of junk science. Offering untested therapies to chelate the mercury out of these children's bodies. Now, with these democratic incursions into research and into actual therapy by a group of activists committed to an unproven theory might seem like another example of the proliferation of junk science or another example of the precautionary principle rearing its ugly head. I think that this case study points to something quite different. The activists forwarding notions of what I've styled as democratic objectivity actually share many of the normative values that separate science from pseudoscience, such as peer review, independent testing, laboratory modeling, controlled trials, and meta-analysis of data. And in fact, they funded several peer research experiments, one in particular at Columbia University, that actually produced a fairly compelling theoretical model anyway to support their theory. However, despite advocating for academic objectivity, citizen groups have failed to achieve this sort of enlightened integration. They've failed to really receive any kind of recognition for the science that they produced and the interpretations that they have put on that science from the medical community at large. Although there are some sympathetic
there's some people sympathetic to some aspects of their argument. They have been successful to some degree in cultivating this rival citizen immunization science with its own discourse, its own institutions, and laboratories of knowledge production. And in many cases, these are embedded in conventional institutions, such as Columbia University, where one of the major animal research experiments was conducted. However, this research, unlike other anti-medical movements, this research was executed by researchers, this researcher, a lion's share of this research was not executed by people you would normally look to produce public health information on immunization. The agents of rival science have really successfully introduced new questions into the scientific research into autism. For example, new research into the epigenetics of autism and regressive autism disorder. Broader questions have been asked and I think are starting to be answered about mercury toxicity, mercury metabolic pathways and the relationship to autistics. And they really have ultimately influenced government policy on immunization. At the core of democratic objectivity is this idea that the outputs of science will be markedly different if the opportunity is provided for citizens to raise different questions and to ultimately produce different kinds of data to formulate different solutions. The choices made over which set of facts to accept will always be a politically and culturally mediated process framed by these competing interests. But it does beg the question, this just summarizes some of the other kinds of impacts that these groups had, but it does beg the question that even the most idealized iteration of a process of a democratic objectivity presupposes a very high level of citizen engagement that would allow for this kind of hypothesis generation. And it also presupposes that that activity would adequately reflect the needs of the citizenry rather than very specific interest groups.